Normative Virtue Ethics by Rosalind Hursthouse. You may have left the Aristotle lecture and or reading wondering, how is anyone supposed to use virtue ethics to figure out what to do or how to act? This is a very common question to have about virtue ethics. After all, virtue ethics provides no hard and fast rule, such as utilitarianism's principle of utility. Hursthouse, who is an eminent and living neo-Aristotelian moral philosopher, has written this entire introductory level article in order to diffuse the criticism that virtue ethics is not helpful in moral decision making. This criticism takes many forms. She addresses 6 of them. Some opponents of virtue ethics object merely to the fact that virtue ethics focuses on character instead of actions. This is not a good objection because virtue ethics actually has the same structure as Kantianism and utilitarianism. Each of the 3 first specify what has moral value, the virtues, a goodwill, and utility, respectively. Then, each theory requires further specification about how to attain the thing of value, emulating an already virtuous person, the categorical imperative, and the principle of utility, respectively. So, it's not valid to object that virtue ethics has a worse structure than the other moral theories available. Some might object that virtue ethics is worse than Kantianism and utilitarianism because emulating a virtuous agent is more difficult than following the procedures given by the other 2 theories. After all, how does one find a virtuous agent to emulate? Hursthouse notes that this is not as difficult or mysterious as it may sound. It is very common practice to find someone who you morally admire, someone kinder, more honest, more just, more wise, and simply to ask her or him what they think you ought to do. In any case, it does not seem any more difficult to locate a moral exemplar than to successfully navigate the moral decision-making procedures advocated by Kantianism and utilitarianism. Hursthouse also notes that virtue ethics may provide moral rules not unlike those of Kantianism and utilitarianism. However, it may be objected that the rules provided by virtue ethics, such as be honest or be generous, are of the wrong kind. This is because virtue terms like honest represent thick concepts. A thick concept is one that combines both a descriptive element and an evaluative element. For example, cruelty describes a harmful act while simultaneously condemning it. Rules containing thick concepts, like those of virtue ethics, are not helpful enough, according to the critics. Yet again, it turns out that virtue ethics is no worse than Kantianism, whose categorical imperative returns similar thick concept containing rules whose applications are difficult to figure out. Perhaps thick concept containing rules are manageable for adults, but a critic of virtue ethics might further claim they are too difficult for children to understand. Since moral education is an important societal function, if virtue ethics cannot help with this, then it must be a deficient moral theory. However, Hursthouse easily sets aside this criticism by noting that it is just plain false that children cannot understand moral rules with thick concepts. For example, don't do that, it hurts, you mustn't be cruel. Or, be kind to your little brother, he's only little. Or, don't be so mean, so greedy. All of these could quite unremarkably and quite successfully be directed towards even very young children. A different kind of criticism is to admit that virtue ethics is indeed action guiding, but to claim that sometimes it seems to endorse conflicting and mutually exclusive actions. For example, mercy and justice are both virtues, but when someone's trying to decide whether to pardon a murderer, it would seem that mercy would speak in favor of granting the pardon, but justice would speak in favor of letting the murderer get punished. However, the mere appearance of conflicts between virtues doesn't mean that there is no fact of the matter about what it is right to do in any given case, according to virtue ethics. Apparent conflicts just indicate that we are less than perfect moral deliberators, as is surely true. Finally, a critic might complain that virtue ethics does not resolve every possible moral dilemma. The evidence for this criticism is that sometimes two equally thoughtful, virtuous, and wise people might disagree about what it is right to do in a particular case. So you might think, this scenario shows that virtue ethics does not resolve whatever problem about which the two disagreed. However, Hursthouse does not think that the critic's conclusion can be drawn from the disagreement scenario. Instead, she thinks that the disagreement scenario provides evidence that both of the actions are morally permissible. If two virtuous people endorse two different actions, then necessarily both actions are justifiable. Virtue ethics may seem like a bad moral theory at first because it is based upon philosophical methods and concepts that have ancient and unfamiliar roots. A variety of objections are raised against virtue ethics on the basis that it cannot help a person to figure out what to do. Hursthouse has plausibly responded to many of these objections. It is no longer obvious that virtue ethics is a worse moral theory than Kantianism in particular, and utilitarianism is no longer popular anyway. Philosophers today continue to debate the respective strong and weak points of these moral theories in the continued hopes of stating and clarifying the elusive nature of human morality.